Yeah, excellent. Good morning, everyone. So I'm actually very excited for this next mini series on our great thinkers. Even more excited because this allows us to look at two thinkers, two for the price of one, two incredibly great figures at the same time, and they both individually, each of them individually is fascinating. Together, they are yet more fascinating. They produced jointly the great halachic guide of the Shulchan Aruch, which has become the standard halachic guide more or less ever since. Each lived in a fascinating part of the world, in a unique and very, very interesting time in history. And they had this remarkable relationship despite never meeting. And they are just so interesting in so many different ways. I'll give a very brief summary of each of their lives, and then we'll look at each of their life stories in much more detail, and then try and understand their joint achievement. So Rabbi Yosef Caro, born in Spain, eventually ends up in Sfat at a very, very important and interesting time of history in Sfat, when Sfat is this bubbling, seething, creative Jewish region. He lives a long life. He lives till 87, I think. Born in 1488, so shortly before the expulsion from Spain, born in Spain, and dying in 1575. So he has a very long life by the standards of the time, 88 years. And he has a contemporary, the Ramah, in faraway, cold Krakow in Poland, born in 1530, so he's 42 years younger than Rabbi Yosef Caro, dies in 1572, so he predeceases Rabbi Yosef Caro. He only lives till 42, much younger person, but they do overlap. And they have this incredibly respectful relationship from afar. They are both aware of each other, obviously, and they correspond, and they're fascinated by each other, and they co-write from the distance this joint halachic work, which is what the Shulchan Aruch is. So it's just really, really very, very interesting. Why are we talking about them in Sunday morning philosophy share? Well, partly because it's a series on great thinkers, and as I've tried to explain, all great thinkers have a philosophy, whether they are philosophers or not, but they have a philosophy which we can extract. In the case of Rabbi Yosef Kaya and the Ramah, besides being halachists of the first order, they are obviously both master halachists. That needs not to be said because they composed the Shulchan Aruch's great halachic work. They also have a differing legal philosophy. Yesterday we had Justice Solomons, who was speaking about different legal philosophies and so on. They both have a legal philosophy which we'll try and understand, and a differing legal philosophy which affects their outcome of their psak, and we'll talk about that. More than that, Rabbi Yosef Caro is a mystic. So besides being a halachist, he's also a Kabbalist, and the Ramah is a philosopher. Not a Kabbalist, but he's a philosopher. So they each beyond the domain of the halacha also engage on a very, very high and serious level in non-halachic pursuits. In the case of Rabbi Yosef Caro, a mystic, the Ramah it's shortchanging him to say he's a philosopher. He's a sort of almost a Renaissance man. He's interested in everything. He's a scientist. He's a historian. He's an astronomer. He's living in Krakow, which is going through is a university city by that point, and going through a sort of Renaissance type experience. And the Ramah is a Renaissance man. He's interested in Hebrew grammar. Is everything everything that there is to be interested in. He's interested in. Okay, so that's the brief overview of their lives. There's a very short synopsis. One in Krakow, one in Sfat, Israel. And both master halachists have enormous respect. It's hard to exaggerate how much respect they have for each other's halachic abilities. Perhaps each of them is uniquely equipped to appreciate the other one because they're such masters of halacha, and but come to occasionally somewhat different halachic conclusions. Okay, so let's now tell the story of each of their lives separately. And then we'll try and talk about the intersection of each of them. Both of them, by the way, did so much more than writing the works for which they're most famed for. So though this is what we all know them for is the Shulchan Aruch, their co-authorship of the Shulchan Aruch, nonetheless, they each had so much else going on. So Rabbi Yosef Caro born in Spain, in Toledo, and expelled from Spain, as I said, born in 1488, expelled from Spain when he was approximately 4. Like many other Spanish Jews, his family ran away to Portugal. They hope that will be a refuge. It's on the Iberian Peninsula. It's a similar culture, similar language. They hope that will work out. It doesn't work out, of course, because 5 years later, in 1497, the Portuguese also expel their Jews. And the level of cruelty, by the way, is just unimaginable. The Spanish expulsion is awful. It's an expulsion. Portugal is far worse in many ways. There's an expulsion of the Jews. It's a betrayal of trust because they had offered them refuge and basically looted them and then kicked them out 5 years later. It's a kidnapping of their children, famously. So many of the Portuguese Jews, their children are kidnapped. They're only able to leave without their children. It's just a beyond horrific time in Jewish history. And then they go on quite typical Spanish-Portuguese path. They run away. They get invited. Basically, they get invited by the Ottomans to settle in the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is based in Constantinople, Istanbul, Turkey, and its Sultan is liberal. He's somewhat believes in multiculturalism, but more important than that, he believes in Jewish entrepreneurship and money and so on. He's keen to attract a middle class, and they move. They travel across the Mediterranean in terrible conditions on rafts and boats, and there's a terrible death rate. Perhaps a third of all Spanish and Portuguese refugees die from disease and hunger and drowning and on the way. So these awful conditions. But basically, they make the hop across from the Iberian Peninsula to Morocco, and then from Morocco make their way into the Turkish Empire, where things become a little easier for them. Rabbi Yosef Caro settles in a range of Ottoman cities. I'm not going to go through all the details. He learns Gemara under his father. He gets married, his wife dies, gets married again, wife dies, married again, his wife dies, but part of the sort of terrible mortality rates at the time. But that in some ways his sort of life story till this point is typical of a Spanish-Portuguese refugee. And in that time, despite all those travails, he manages to learn Torah, as we'll see, I mean, to the highest level imaginable. Sorry, Rabbi. So, okay, it's a very good question. So maybe let me just talk a little bit briefly about the history of expulsion of Jews from Spain. So the truth is there's several waves of... So Spain was, for a period of time, almost the whole Iberian Peninsula was a Muslim, under various Islamic empires. Gradually, the Christians reconquer it, bit by bit, piece by piece. Spain isn't really a unified country. It's lots of little kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, and so on and so forth. But eventually, it becomes united into Spain. And 1492, very soon after it achieved unity and they've reconquered the whole peninsula, they expel the Jews in 1492. What's less well known is that there are earlier waves of forced conversion and mini expulsions. I'm talking about from the 1300s and on. And very, very briefly, the history is as follows. In the 1300s, Christian persecution starts of Jews, and there's waves of forcible conversion. Some Jews choose to convert for economic advancement and integration. And they think, well, it's a big deal. We're nominally converting, but we'll stay as Jews. And they become the so-called new Christians, and they are living, in many ways, quite a Jewish life, or at least very closely connected to their Jewish brethren. The Christian Spain becomes increasingly frustrated with this fake situation, and they do two things to resolve it. The first is they conclude that's it. We just need to get rid of Jews completely off the peninsula or off Spain, out of Spain, because the Jews who are still living here are connecting with their brethren who have converted to Christianity and stopping them properly immersing in Christianity. And the second thing is we need the famous Inquisition to investigate who's genuinely Christian and who isn't. The Inquisition isn't really designed to start on Jews. If you're Jewish, that's fine in the year 1480, 1470, pre-expulsion. Jews can stay Jews, but if you've converted, that we can't live with. If you've converted and you're still being Jewish, that we can't live with. So the Marano period is on a smaller scale, really, from the 1300s, mid and late 1300s and on, for about 100 years. In 1492, the big decree of expulsion happens, and at that point, a unprecedented tragedy in Jewish history occurs, in which a third of Jews crumble and convert to Christianity. So it's a terrible blow, and that's what we think of as the Marano era. So that's the mass conversion on a large scale. But there have been conversos or hidden Jews for roughly 100 years in Spanish Jewish tradition. And after 1492, any open Jew has left. Rabbi Yosef Caro's family are from the noble families that leave and phenomenal Mesirat Nefesh. And now Spain is clean of any open Jews, though it still has a significant Jewish population who think this is short term, it'll pass, these things get over with, and will stay loyal to Judaism. Maybe some of them on the greatest from us Jews in agreeing to do this. Some of them probably think, this isn't the end of the world, we'll keep a Jewish practice, and they don't understand that that's it. The shutters have come down. Spanish Jewry undergoes a trauma from which arguably it's never really recovered. On a numbers level, it goes from being 90% of the Jewish population, perhaps, so it's a massive Jewish community, to maybe 10% of the Jewish population. It's now creeping up, but still below 50%. Most Jews in the world are Ashkenazi. That's for many, many reasons. I don't want to go through all of them, including the population explosion in Europe, but basically it goes through a catastrophic loss of numbers. It also engages in a lot of reflection about what allowed this terrible dropout rate. How could it be that our community failed in such a terrible way? Look at our Ashkenazi brethren in the Crusades and in Germany and so on, who didn't crumble like that. Conversion rates in the Ashkenazi world are tiny. And the conclusion, fair or not, I'm not going to comment on that, but the conclusion emerges that we engaged too deeply in Spanish culture. We felt too at home there. We learnt Arab, Spanish philosophy. We've discussed that a lot, this sort of Aristotelian, Platonic combination that the Rambam is most famous for, but many, many Spanish Jews do. A part of, we entered Spanish nobility, we felt very at home in Spain, and that led to a weakening of our Jewish identity. And that's how this terrible travesty and disaster of mass conversion occurred. And we need to retreat inwards. And basically, ever since then, Spanish Jewry, at least Eastern Spanish Jewry, retreated inwards. They turned away from philosophy to Kabbalah. There had already been tensions, which we've discussed before, and we'll rediscuss no doubt again, between philosophy and Kabbalah as a system. But Spanish Jewry, Sephardi Jewry, turns towards Kabbalah, to mysticism. We'll see this is quite prominent in the life of Rabbi Yosef Karo, who reflects this trend himself as an individual. And the sort of, using an anachronistic term, the sort of modern orthodoxy, as it were, that this orthodoxy, but also engaging in culture in a very significant way, really leaves the tiny fragments of it left in the Sephardi world. But 99% of the Sephardi world is completely rejected, moves away from that sort of style and view and philosophy. Yeah.
Is it, for instance, 1492 when Columbus set out?
Very interesting, and no one knows the answer to that question. From a mystical point of view, it is interesting that at the time of the expulsion of the largest Jewish community, you have the first discovery from a European point of view of what will become a new Jewish safe haven eventually in America. From a historical point of view, it's possible Columbus comes from a converso family. Which converso family, earlier stage converso family, as I said, people didn't convert in 1492. It's possible that part of his thinking out of the box, part of his entrepreneurial spirit, because you're an entrepreneur if you're exploring the world and you're willing to take risks, and part of his desire to discover a new world may be linked to his converso identity. This has been rumbling around in history for hundreds of years, and particularly the last 100 years. You will be pleased to know that it's achieved prominence in the last couple of years amongst the far left, because this really feeds neatly into the colonial narrative in which it's a Jew who leads this great colonial project of I'm being serious here, I mean, it's just balmy, and it's a Jew that leads this great colonial project of discovering America, and they're to blame for, the Native American persecution and the thing, and the whole, America really ought to be given back to the Native Americans, as we know, and is a travesty itself, and it really is, it's there. I mean, Google it, it's just absolutely out there now, that yet again, of course, the Jews were the most prominent people in the black slave trade, and the Jews were the most prominent in everything awful, and amongst that is that it's Columbus, a Jew, who's leading the colonial project, and it's balmy stuff. But the answer from a historical point of view, maybe not, we don't really know. Very hard to determine, but there may be some minor links. They're not significant links. Okay, so Rabbi Yosef Caro going through this sort of fairly sad and typical journey of Spanish Jews. Basically, we'll go in more detail through his story in a few minutes, but basically he ends up in Tzfat. Why does he end up in Sfat? Because he wants to be in Eretz Israel. That's his motive. It's not just a convenient place to go to. And he's a mystic, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And mystics best are able to practice in Sfat. And there is a burgeoning Jewish community there, of which he becomes a very significant member. But it's already a growing Jewish community before he arrives there. Basically, for about a century, for 90 years, Tzfat becomes the most famous Jewish city in the Jewish world. It's unbelievable. The population of Jews in Eretz Israel are very, very small. And there are some Jews in. It's not true that Eretz Israel is emptied of Jews for 2,000 years. That's historical myth. Till the year 500, there's a very big and prominent Jewish community there. That's where the Mishnah is written. Till the year 900, there's a smaller Jewish community there, but there's still yeshivas there. There's big projects taking place. For example, the Bali Masorah, the research project into exactly how to vowel and punctuate the Torah text, and various other big projects taking place. From 900 till about 1200, there's really a very, very dormant Jewish community. In the year 1200 and on, Jews are moving back to Eretz Yisrael. Ashkenazi Jews are moving, a massive convoy of Bali toasters move there, and 300 of them, linked to the Crusades, so there's paths of travel from Christendom to the Holy Land. Sfardim are moving there, I think Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and we've spoken about it before. And then in 1492, there's this massive influx of Sfardim moving there as a result of persecution. So Eretz Yisrael's always had Jewish communities, but for a time, Sfat becomes the Jewish community almost out of nowhere. And we know basically why. It's got this incredible influx of Torah scholarship from Spanish refugees largely, and it goes to an economic boom. Economic booms are important for flourishing of Torah, by the way. Torah can only flourish if there's the resources available for people to engage in Torah scholarship, and a community can only support Torah scholarship if it first of all has a critical mass enough of a population, and it has money for people to be non-economically productive, as it were, and learn Torah. So Torah centers can only arise. Bovel, we discussed why Bovel declined and the Ashkenazi world arose. And for example, we discussed this mystery from the year, let's say, 850 to 950, where you see this decline of Bovel and rise of Ashkenaz. A large part of that is economic forces. We discussed when we were learning the rise of Ashkenaz, when we were looking at the Rashi's life, how that part of Germany and France goes through an economic boom. It's got calm economic times. It's got Charlemagne and the whole Carolingian Empire and so on. So things are calm then. So you always need good economic circumstances for Jewish scholarship to flourish. And Sfat goes through a economic boom. Why does it go through an economic boom? It's located along a good trade route. It's a free enterprise zone. The Ottomans quite literally make it a free enterprise zone. They give tax reductions there. They want it to boom because they see economic potential, and it's been a bit of a backwater. There's a very interesting figure called Yosef Nasi, who's a Spanish refugee who makes his fortune. And anyone heard of Donna Gracia Mendes? Is that a familiar name to anyone? Gracia Mendes, I'm probably mispronouncing her name. Okay, so basically, without going through the whole story, there is a Spanish Jewish refugee woman, Don Gracias Mendes, who inherits enormous wealth. She makes her money, as was traditional for women in those days, by losing her husband. And in other words, women don't have economic independence when they have spouses. But if her husband dies and she's capable and her children aren't old enough, then she's able to run the empire, and she's an enormously talented businesswoman. And her combined with her nephew, Don Yosef Nasi, by the way, revealing term, Nasi means prince. He's a Jewish leader, become enormously wealthy. They have branches in Amsterdam and elsewhere, but mainly eventually end up in the Ottoman Empire. They become very close to the Ottoman Sultan, and they buy up large tracts of land in Tiberia and around Safat, in the Galil, basically, as part of a resettlement project. It's quite amazing. It's a bit like the Rothschilds several hundred years later, who buy up lands and in Zechon Yaakov and places like that, and try and get Jewish resettlement to go. So they're doing this in the late 1400s, early 1500s. They persuade the Ottoman Empire, look, if you can get Jews there, they'll be economically productive. And the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan gives a sort of tax break there, and it becomes a free enterprise zone. Either way, for our purposes, Safat goes through an economic boom, and partly because of that, and partly because of the wave of creative Spanish Jewish immigrants, Safat becomes a Torah center. Sorry, you wanted to, no? Okay, sorry, no. Okay.
What's the start?
I believe about 30,000, something like that. So a good sized population, yeah. By the standards of the day, perhaps Hendon type Jewish population. Okay. So that's where the Rabbi Yosef Caro ends up. Okay, let's talk in a little, and there he writes his famous works and so on. Let's talk about in a little more detail about some of the influences on his life. So Rabbi Yosef Caro is so influenced, unsurprisingly, by the trauma that he and his family and his community have been through. And it looms large in his life. It has a very significant impact on his life. He's drawn to Kabbalah, and maybe I'll just talk a little bit about some of the people that he learns from. He learns, as I said, Talmud from his father. He studies under Reb Yaakov Beirav, whose name we will come back to later, in Halacha, and in Kabbalah he studies under Reb Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz. We spoke about him before, the author of L'Chododi and a Kabbalist of significance. He has a student, the Alshich, who I think we've spoken about before, and he's a serious Kabbalist. He is he overlaps with the Ari. He meets the Ari in Sfat. And okay, very briefly, because I'm not going into too much depth, but I've mentioned, I think, this previously. So the Ari, there is a predecessor to the Ari, who we did discuss, called Moshe Cordovero. And we discussed this in the Sunday morning series, who wrote many outstanding Kabbalistic works, including his most famous work, the Tomer and Devorah, the Palm Tree of Devorah. And he is the first great systemizer of Kabbalah. So he brings together this vast array of disparate Kabbalistic sources and systemizes it. He enables the Ari to make his much more famous and popular systemization of Kabbalah, and therefore the Ramak's reign of seniority is very, very short. Basically, the Ari is fascinated by the Ramak, sees there's something exciting going on, there's this new systemization of Kabbalah taking place, and he travels from Egypt to Israel to learn under Sfat, to learn under the Ramak. The Ramak dies after a couple of years, I think, after the Ari being there, and now the Ari rises to prominence and re-systemizes Kabbalah, but he could only do this because of the vast encyclopedic work of the Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, who precedes him. And the Ari's system takes over, and therefore almost no one learns the Ramak's system of Kabbalah, even though his individual works are still very, very popular. Rabbi Yosef Caro, in some ways, is a pre-Lurianic Kabbalist. He's very influenced by Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, and he learns under Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, and the Ramak is part of that sort of Beit HaMedrash, part of that system of learning, and he never becomes an insider for the Ari's circle, even though he's interested in it and fascinated by the Ari and learns from him, but he never becomes a sort of Talmud of the Ari or Lurianic Kabbalist in that sense. According to some sources, he's distanced by the Arizal deliberately. The Arizal says, look, you're an okay Kabbalist, but your life's work is halachis. Don't worry about my sort of niche, my advances in Kabbalah. That's not what your chedek of Torah. That's not what you need to focus on. According to some sources, he's a bit hurt by that, but that's it. The Arizal isn't. The fact is, he doesn't become an insider to the Ari's circle of mystics, even though he's connected to that. Okay. What can we say about what else can we say about Rabbi Yosef Caro? Because his life is just so interesting. So he's profoundly affected by the trauma of the expulsion from Spain, and there's so much to say about that. I'm going to sort of struggle to bring everything in, but very briefly, he's influenced by an enormous range of really, really interesting characters. I'll just share with you the story of one of them. There is a fascinating figure called Shlomo Molcho. Rings a bell to anyone? Shlomo Molcho. So Shlomo Molcho is a descendant of Spanish conversos. He becomes a Baal Teshuvah. Another area we could explore on Sunday morning is the subject of Bali Teshuvah from Spanish conversion programs and that whole phenomenon. Really, really interesting patch of Jewish history. But basically, there's waves of Jews whose family have converted, pseudo-converted to Christianity, grow up in a very non-Jewish environment, and then become Bali Teshuvah and rejoin the Jewish people. Now, what I'm going to say is sensitive, but a historic fact, that large waves of these Bali Teshuvah joining the Jewish people present a challenge to the settled community. Why? Because individuals who are willing to make such a remarkable change to their lives are extraordinary people, incredible. It takes what strength it takes to become a Baal Teshuvah. Many of them integrate well into the community, but some of them don't integrate so well because these are people trying to rejoin a Jewish world from which they've become disconnected. Very, very interesting. Let me just give you an example of a couple of them. De Costa, Uriel de Costa. He's a type of Spinoza type figure. He rejoins the Jewish people in Amsterdam, and he has all sorts of philosophical ideas. And people say to him, "Look, be quiet. What do you know about Judaism? You're a newcomer. You don't really have the right to voice these views. You're trying to come along with your philosophical ideas and Christian influenced ideas." And he's banned, like Moses 20 years later. He's completely discarded by the Jewish community. Really, really tragic episode. Ends up committing suicide, like a terrible, terrible incident in Jewish history. 20 years later, Spinoza comes from a very similar background also. Again, so it presents challenges when you have people who have been away from the Jewish community and then come back. Okay, Shlomo Molcho is a figure who becomes a Baal Teshuvah. What's the opposite thing that can happen? You become sort of over extreme in your desire to join the Jewish people. Shlomo Molcho, I want to be careful about him because it's lost in history what to make of this extraordinary character. He is someone who engages in bizarre practices. He's a mystic to the extreme in a very unusual way for Jews to be mystics. He again and again, sort of people are saying to him, "Okay, calm down. Like you're going OTT. Like take your time and don't go so far." But he's also very influential, and the Beis Yosef meets him in Ottoman Turkey and is fascinated by him for the rest of his life. Very, very interesting individual. So I mention this simply to say that the Beis Yosef is drawn by the suffering of his Spanish brethren. He's looking for answers, and he becomes close to the Shlomo Molcho, and therefore this very interesting character in Jewish history. We don't really know what to make of it. The Beis Yosef takes him seriously. Very, very fascinating. The Shlomo Molcho, I don't know, Reb Shlomo Molcho, we don't know what to make of him, eventually declares himself Moshiach. Very, very interesting. And in history has sort of gone down as a false Moshiach, but he's not a simple character. He's someone who seems to be moved by desperation to fix the Jewish world. I don't think we can underestimate just how desperate the Jewish world at the time, the Sephardi Jewish world, obviously in particular. And he declares himself Moshiach. He goes to marches to Rome and confronts the Pope and ends up burnt on the stake. And Rabbi Yosef is just fascinated by this story. It's very interesting. And the heroism of this person who comes from this very assimilated Jewish background, very non-Jewish background, sadly, and has rejoined the Jewish people. He's absolutely fascinated by it. We have evidence that Rabbi Yosef spends his life hoping to die a martyr's death. Really interesting. So you have this individual who, and here I want to point out something very interesting phenomenon of Jewish history. We often think of mystics and halachists as being two separate domains. To be a top halachist, you have to be a legalist of the first order. You have to have a mind which is enormously clear and systematic thinker. And I think one can say without exaggeration that in 1,000 years, there's almost been, or perhaps hasn't been, a legal mind like Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Jewish world. I want us to understand when we're talking about this individual, we're talking about perhaps the finest legal mind of 1,000 years. It's just phenomenal. So you have someone who is so such to be a top legal scholar, you're such a systematic thinker, and such a clear thinker, and such as and at the same time he's a mystic, and somehow in many examples in Jewish tradition these go together. The Vilna Gaon is another famous example. So Rabbi Yosef Karo is fascinated by the mystical stirrings of Molcho and his whole life, and we'll see shortly that Rabbi Yosef Karo is has his own mystical experiences which are truly remarkable. Okay, so just to summarize what we've said so far, he goes through the very typical journey of a Spanish refugee, Spain, Portugal, wandering around the Mediterranean basin, ends up finding sanctuary in Ottoman Turkey, and things then get nicer and calmer. He's able to learn Torah to the highest level, becomes a student of some of the most prominent halachists and Kabbalists of his day, and moves to Safat, where he lives the rest of his life. Very briefly in Safat, for a short time, he is under the influence of a more senior halachist, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, who is less well known. Rabbi Yaakov Beirav is the Av Beis Din and so on. Rabbi Yosef Karo then, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav dies. He's appointed his successor, and now he is the senior halachist in Safat. and eventually the senior halachist in Eretz Yisrael, then the most senior halachist in the Sephardi world, and eventually the most senior halachist in the world at large at all. And his influence is unimaginable. His influence is vast. When there's community divisions in France and politics there, he's the one that letters are written to. He's just the preeminent Jewish halachic leader in the world at the time, and then eventually, as we said, dies in Tzfat. So that's the story of his life. And let's just talk about some of the important highlights of this story. One very famous episode is the story of the attempt to renew Samicha, again linked to Spanish expulsion, Messianic stirrings, and the like. Okay, so a bit of background over here. And again, Rabbi Caro is so influenced by this. When you go through an event like the Spanish expulsion, it's so traumatic that almost invariably it's followed by Messianic yearnings and a desire to sort out the mess and things like that. Rabbi Yosef Caro is a prominent halachist. His Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, says, let's restore Samicha. Let's just talk about Samicha. So until Roman persecutions, rabbinic ordination, so-called Samicha, has had an unbroken chain of tradition, according to the way we understand things, of Rebbe to Talmud. So we find already a Moshe putting his hands on Yeshua in order to give him authority, a leadership authority, halachic ruling authority, and that goes on through the generations. There's an unbroken chain of rabbinic ordination. The Gemara describes this institution gradually waning due to Roman persecution. It describes a scene in which Yeshua tries to give Samicha to 5 of his students, and he's chased by the Romans, so it becomes ever more difficult, and basically Samicha dies out. Original rabbinic ordination dies out, and all we have now is a sort of pale copy of it. What we call Samicha nowadays, rabbinic ordination, is simply permission from a teacher to a student to paskin. That's the switch, by the way, from the title Rebbe to the title Rav. So if you learn Mishnah, the title that's used is Rebbe. This continues to a couple of generations of Amoraim, of Talmudic era Rabbanim, particularly in Eretz Yisrael. But in Bovel, Samicha dies out earlier, and it can only be given in Eretz Yisrael. And the title now Rav is adopted by the later Amoraim to indicate that they're not Rebbe, they're Rav. They don't have real Samicha, they've only got permission to give halachic rulings. Comes along Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, and he looks at a passage in the Rambam. We spoke about this Rambam over COVID when we were speaking about rabbinic authority, and I think Torah Sheba'al Peh. But basically, the Rambam has a view that the concept of Samicha and the concept of Sanhedrin, and you need Samicha in order to have a Sanhedrin, is that they somehow represent the whole collective Torah wisdom of the Jewish people. And that's their authority. It's a sort of bottom-up authority. We think of rabbinic authority as being top-down because you have this hierarchical structure of the Sanhedrin and Psak and so on. But the Rambam sees that, in a sense, its authority derives from this bottom-up sense of this is the Sanhedrin represents the collective Torah knowledge of the Jewish people. And the Rambam says that we can, in theory, restore genuine rabbinic smicha, the original smicha, if all the sages of Israel agree on appointing a candidate, then he gets smicha, and then he can appoint successors. He can give smicha outwards, and you can diffuse smicha on, and we can restore this chain of transmission. Now, what's the advantage of restoring smicha? Well, you can get proper Botei Din back. A modern-day Beis Din doesn't really have proper power to give onshim. We can't do Chiyuv Misa. We can't do genuine makas. But you can't give proper punishments. There's a whole range of fines that we aren't allowed to give. We can basically do civil justice to a degree, but not more than that. Now, there were Jewish communities where the Jewish community allowed Botei Din a little more authority. But even then, it's not true Sanhedrin. There's various decrees that we can't annul. Indeed, there's a halachic problem, which is which Jewish body is going to recognize Mashiach when he comes and grant him Mashiach status. It takes Sanhedrin. How are you going to get Sanhedrin? This is one halachic way of understanding the role of Eliyahu. So Eliyahu has this strange role. He is the Mavaseh, the announcer of Moshiach coming. The Pasuk at the end of Malachi seems to indicate that ADO will come back. There'll be a return of ADO. Why is ADO necessary to announce Mashiach? Why do we need someone to announce Mashiach? Well, a halachic answer may be because ADO has smicha. He's part of the unbroken chain of tradition, of the broken chain of tradition that the Rambam lists in the beginning of Mishnah Torah. So ADO will come back. He can then give smicha, and he has sort of halachic authority to grant Mashiach status and so on. Rabbi Yosef Caro and his Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, who's also a Spanish refugee, want to restore semicha to the Jewish world. Why? So that they can bring a tikkun, a repair, to the Spanish refugees who did convert, the conversos. So if you are conversing, you're coming back to the Jewish people, and you can have a Sanhedrin who can recognize your Jewish status and perhaps impose penalties and punishments if you did things wrong, then that allows you a tshuva process. So you have a range of conversos desperate to rejoin the Jewish people, many of whom are profoundly ashamed of their decision to convert to Christianity and regret it and want to come back. And if you could have a Sanhedrin, they could give them a tikkun, they could give them appropriate onshim, perhaps give them makkos if that's what they deserve, and lashes, and then they can achieve their repair. So Rabbi Yosef Caro is part of this project to restore semicha, and it more prominently led by his Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, and he restores it. He believes that they have crossed the halachic threshold, and the majority of sages of the land of Israel have agreed to this, and now we're able to establish semicha. And once there's smicha, we can make a Sanhedrin, and we can relook at halacha anew in a refreshed way. And he wants to be part of this project. Does anyone know when else in history there was a desire to sort of restore smicha and a Sanhedrin and so on? Sorry? In Napoleonic times, it was a fake. There was a Sanhedrin. Maybe we'll look at it another time. It's not a real Sanhedrin. It's got no one takes it seriously as a Sanhedrin. When post-State of Israel, yeah. So there was talk about maybe we have the ability to restore Sanhedrin again. Famously, Heichal Shlomo was perhaps going to be the seat of this Sanhedrin. Enormous controversy about it, and unsurprisingly, enormous controversy in the life of Rabbi Yaakov Beirav and Rabbi Yosef Caro about this. And it doesn't win universal acclaim, and eventually this project peters out. It's a who's list of Jewish leadership at the time, those who are supportive of it, those who aren't supportive of it, but basically it doesn't get universal support. And almost by definition, if it doesn't get universal support, then the project has failed, because the whole point is that this is a project that gets universal support, and it doesn't. The sages of Yerushalayim don't agree with the project, and they say, we're Yerushalayim, we're the most central community. Sages of Sfat say, you were once the most central community, but you're now a little community. Sfat is the most central community in the land of Israel, and it doesn't take off. But it does last for several generations. Rabbi Yosef Caro receives this smicha from his Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. He in turn gives the smicha to a number of his students, including the Alshich, and including Ephraim Vital, the students of the Arizal. But this is another project which the Beis Yosef is involved in. Okay, so this is some of the side issues of the Beis Yosef's life. Let's talk now about the most prominent part of the Beis Yosef's life, which is the authorship of the Shulchan Aruch. We don't know, by the way, massive amounts about the Beis Yosef's life, like all these historic figures. There's a very famous picture floating around of the Beis Yosef's, which actually features the graphic artist who went on the flyer that we've got out for Great Thinkers. There's a range of rabbis at the bottom of the picture, and one of them is the portrait ascribed supposedly to be that of Rabbi Yosef Caro. No one really thinks it is his portrait, like many historic photos, but that's what Rabbi Yosef Caro didn't look like. Okay, so that's the just a word about his portrait. We have his writings, by the way. We do know what his handwriting looks like. We've got his signature, we've got his writings, we've got some manuscripts from him very nicely. Okay, what else can we say about Rabbi Yosef Caro? So I mentioned already that he is a mystic of the first order. He's not a Lurianic mystic, he doesn't enter that inner circle, but he is a mystic. And we have an amazing, incredible work from him called the Magid Meishorim, which is his diary of his mystical experiences. So this is an incredible privilege to see a diary of a mystic like Rabbi Yosef Caro, and an authentic mystic. What do I mean by an authentic mystic? Within this room, there'll be a range of views about how to understand mysticism, and is it an inner psychological experience? Is it genuinely channeling spirit? There's different ways of understanding what mysticism is. When I say it's genuine, what I mean is he's not a faker. He's describing his 100% genuine experiences. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. We're talking about the most famous person in the world who's reading halachic view supreme, and he has a personal diary, not plans for publication, in which which he writes his mystical experiences. Just absolutely remarkable work to see. According to tradition, it's only a fraction of his mystical experiences. Some say that it's a 50th of his mystical experiences, not an exact scientific number, but that gives you, his students say, that gives you a sort of ratio of what it really was. And he has an amazing experiences there. He experienced there's some posh word for it when a voice comes out, you experience like auto writing and auto speaking. It's quite a well-known phenomena from mystical experiences. He experiences voices speaking through his vocal cords. We have an amazing testimony in which this happened one Shavuos night, and people around heard this. He's experiencing what's called a Maggid in mystical thought. A Maggid is an angelic teacher. So he has a spiritual force, a Maggid, that teaches him things, mystical insight and the like. And occasionally even teaches him halachas, though as far as we can tell, it doesn't impact his actual halachic decision making. So when it comes to legal matters, he's a legalist, but occasionally halachic matters, but more often mystical experiences. He experiences the area of a Maggid is a very complicated one, but many mystics, Jewish mystics that is, who are halachists, were offered magidim, were offered spiritual mentors of sorts, spiritual horses, malachim, who wanted to teach them things. Famously, the Vilna Gaon refused his offer of a magid. The Vilna Gaon was a mystic also and had a mystical experience in which he was offered a magid and refused it. He says that's Torah lo b'shamayim, Torah's not in heaven. That's not how Torah is meant to be learned. We're meant to learn Torah from our own endeavor. And anyway, how do we know the reliability of magidim? That's not. You can't develop halachic thought and so on through a magid. We've never discussed in this circle, but one day we'll get to it. I was actually planning to do it just before my sabbatical, and then on my sabbatical, Rabbi Pollock spoke a lot about the Baal Shem Tov, so I'll delay a year or two before we come back to the Baal Shem Tov, but we will get there, because there's things I want to say. But the Vilna Gaon, the Baal Shem Tov reputedly did have a Maggid, and that may have been one of the Vilna Gaon's criticisms of the Baal Shem Tov, that he was over-influenced by the Maggid, and so on. This is a well-known phenomenon. Either way, just to summarize, the Beis Yosef had a Maggid, and we have a record of his spiritual experiences that are absolutely remarkable. More than that, he experienced the Maggid as being the neshama of the Mishnah. In other words, somehow the spiritual personification of the Mishnah itself. Very, very interesting experience. And we even have records of some of the things the Maggid told him, some of which proved to be accurate and some of which didn't prove to be accurate. But they're there in the diary. One of the inaccurate things he got from the Maggid is, the Maggid told him he was going to die al Kiddush Hashem, burnt as a martyr on the stake, like Shlomo Molcho. So I mentioned Shlomo Molcho, it's very interesting. Did that happen? On an open level, no. Maybe on some mystical level, his neshama went through a similar experience. The problem with these things is we don't know what to make of these things. We don't know how to translate them into action. The Maggid also tells him something very interesting. We're going to come to this in a moment. The Maggid tells him, get on, rush to write your halachic works, because there is a sage in Krakow, the Ramah, who is working on a similar project, and you better get there first, because that's the way things are meant to work out. So this is like a scary story. What are you meant to make of that? And we'll talk about that again in a few minutes when we talk about the relationship between the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch and Rabbi Karo and so on. It's there in the public domain. You can find it online and in Otzar Chochmah and other books. Very, very interesting mystical work and truly remarkable. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so this is one of the sources of staying up all night. Tikkun Leil Shavuos is not a 1,000-year-old minhag. It emerges from the Kabbalists in Tzfat, and Rabbi Karo is one of the people that publicize it. His Talmidim publicize it. And the very name Tikkun Leil Shavuos, Tikkun, the repair of Leil Shavuos, right? Tikkun is a Kabbalistic idea of repairing a sort of broken spiritual world and so on. Very important in Arizal Kabbalah, Tikkunim, but in other schools of Kabbalah also, yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the first recorded examples we have of people staying up the whole night of Shavuos. Interestingly, and maybe we can introduce this in there, they stayed up both nights of Shavuos. He had this mystical experience in Chutz La'aretz, still later moved to Eretz Yisrael. So those who are interested in signing up for second Leil Shavuos, I'm happy for people to volunteer to ignore it. To organize it. I don't plan to be there myself. Okay, so that's that. But yeah, but that's the Tikkun Leil Shavuos. Very, very interesting. Okay, so he's a mystic. But let's now get to, we've been evading it long enough, the works for which he is most famous. Gentlemen, ladies, his literary output, his halachic output is simply unimaginable, inconceivable. We've spoken about many greats over time. We've spoken about how Rashi, it's difficult to understand how Rashi did what he did. And we've spoken about how even Rashi may have had somewhat of a sort of a little bit of a committee of helpers, maybe in some ways. Some of them may have helped him a little bit with this, research assistants of sorts. Rabbi Yosef Caro is just indescribable, and it's hard to explain the enormity of his work. It's just so vast. It's just inconceivable. And we're talking about a relatively recent figure with many students around him. So we don't know massive details about every detail of his life, but we know about his literary output because he's surrounded by Talmidim. He's a Rosh Yeshiva, by the way. I should mention he's a Rosh Yeshiva. We have first-hand report of a traveler who visited his yeshiva and describes the scene in the yeshiva. Really, really interesting. A Yemenite traveler. So we know like a lot about what's going on around him. He's not a mysterious figure. And we know he wrote these works. What works does he write? So the first thing he decides to do is to write a encyclopedia, basically, of halacha, of all practical halacha. And he writes in his introduction that he's going to build this round the Torah Shulchan Aruch, the Torah. Okay, what is the Torah? So in the 1300s, Rabbeinu Moshe, known as the Rosh, who is a student of the Bali Tosfos and a student of the Maram Mirottenberg, who famously is kidnapped by the German king, decides Germany is no longer livable in and runs away to Spain. The Rosh, Rabbi Moshe, a very important halachic authority. He is a halachist himself. He takes all the work of the Bali Tosfos that preceded him and summarizes it into a halachic work that's known as the Rosh, ordered on the order of the Talmud. So on every page of Gemara, he discusses any relevant halachas connected to that page and puts together a halachic work, basically systemizing all the thoughts of 200 years that preceded him of this enormous creativity of the Bali Tosfos. The Rosh is also an important bridge figure because he moves from Germany to Spain and therefore bridges the Ashkenazi and Sephardi worlds. He arrives in Spain, in Barcelona. He meets the Rashba. They become friends. They become almost co-rabbis of the city. And he bridges the two worlds. And he's one of the key figures that brings yet more knowledge of the Ashkenazi way of learning. And he sort of conquers Spain in many ways. In fact, we have testimony from Spanish Jews of the time that all of us in Spain follow the Pesukim of the Rosh. So Spain becomes Ashkenazified in a very significant way, but not completely. And to this day, by the way, the remnant of Spanish Jewry that lives in Morocco in North Africa are somewhat Ashkenazi in their Piskei Halacha. They're not pure Sephardic in how they Paskin, but we'll come to that all later. Rabbeinu Moshe, the Rosh, has a son called Rabbeinu Yaakov, who wants to take this vast array of halachic scholarship, meaning his father's Tosafist traditions and the Sephardi traditions that he's met, the Rambam and others, and he codifies them into a codex of Jewish law, structuring it into 4 sections, which, if you like, you can call it a type of proto-Shulchan Aruch in a way, because that's what gives body, that's the structure that eventually Rabbi Yosef Karo follows for his Shulchan Aruch. And it becomes a very important halachic work. It's a brief work, but it's divided into the 4 sections that we have to this day in Shulchan Aruch, Ephraim and Choshen Mishpah, Ephraim dealing with daily life, Choshen Mishpah with monetary law, Yoredea, which is kashrus and so on, Even Ezer, which is marital law and other things. So he divides it into these 4 sections, and Rabbi Yosef Karo decides to write an encyclopedic Jewish work of all halacha so far, and he structures it around the Torah. It's not really a commentary on the Torah. It uses the Torah as a sort of springboard to summarize everything there is to know. And it does not include non-irrelevant parts of halacha. So unlike the Rambam, who tries to do everything, kodshim and taras, Beis HaMikdash service and so on, it's only on practical halacha. But in a sense, it's a bigger work than the Rambam's work. Because the Rambam is basically saying, I'm going to learn Talmud and a little bit the Gaonic tradition. It's not such a vast body of learning. And I'm going to then write my own view about how to Paskin. So the Rambam's a monumental work. Yosef Karo, in a sense, is setting himself a bigger task. He says, I'm going to try and summarize in the Beis Yosef everything. From the Talmud Mishnah through to the Talmud, through to all the Rishonim, and there's 500 years since the Rambam, more or less, 400 years since the Rambam, but even before the Rambam, there's a vast array of Rishonim. We've got Rashi and the Tosfos and the Rosh and the Ramban and the Rashba and the Ritva, and the whole array of Rishonim, and I'm going to give you an organized, structured summary of all of this. So basically, and to this day this remains true, you can learn through Beis Yosef, and in a pretty clear work, even for, I'm thinking, it's the Beis Yosef, it's phenomenally clear, but even for an relatively uninformed scholar, you can learn your way through Beis Yosef, and you'll have laid out for you in a coherent, neat, beautiful structure the whole summary of the sugya. Don't forget, by the way, the Torah has already taken the Rosh's writing, which is arranged on the pages of the Talmud, and therefore all over the place, because the Talmud goes all over the place in its discussions, and he's giving you an organized system. When you open Gemara, if you want to know about, can I do a certain malach on Shabbos? Well, which page of Masechet Shabbos am I meant to find it on? And you can't just know Shabbos from learning Masechet Shabbos. You can have a Gemara about Shabbos in Baba Kama. So it's all Gemara's all over the place because it's free flow discussion. So the Rosh is a limited work in the sense that if you want to know the halach on something, you can open the page of Gemara and see how the Rosh presents, but you may be missing crucial information from another daf in Shas. So the Torah's already in the sense sorted that out. But the Beis Yosef now takes that structure that the Torah has helpfully provided and writes this encyclopedic work. I want to tell you, gentlemen, that on most sugyas, the Beis Yosef is grappling and playing with maybe 30 different viewpoints at any one time. It's just mind-boggling. He lists 32 major works that he's including in halachic works that he's including in his encyclopedia, and the truth is there's many more. So in his introduction, there's 32, but there's many, many more. And the ability of someone to classify so much material in such a systematic way is just incredible. And this is his work known as the Beis Yosef, the commentary, so-called commentary on the Torah. It's really uses the Torah as a springboard, and this is just one of his works. In fact, in many ways, the less known work, because we're going to get to the Shulchan Aruch shortly, which is far better known. So what does this mean? What's it mean to have a mind like that? It's simply inconceivable. Sorry, Johnny. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this is the first achievement the first major achievement of the Beis Yosef halachically. At the same time, he's being a busy Rosh Hashiva. At the same time, he's being a leader of world Jewry. He's also a refugee running all over the place for a chunk of his life. He's also a halachist in the sense that he's getting constant questions backwards and forwards. He's also a mystic. I mean, what does it mean to be someone who achieves this in their life? It's just indescribable. Okay, that's one of his achievements. That's the first achievement. Other ones come back, so I'll mention just the highlights of what you missed, which is a typical piece in the Beis Yosef would include 30 Rishonim in his summary. Just absolutely phenomenal. You're a lawyer, so you can appreciate the ability of grappling with this sort of information. Just unimaginable. Okay, this is his Beis Yosef. In addition, he draws halachic conclusions at the end of this. So he's not just an encyclopedic writer, but he is a halachist. And we'll talk next week about his style of halachic psak, how he draws halachic conclusions. He then writes what becomes perhaps the preeminent commentary on the Rambam, Kasef Mishnah, in which this is a commentary on the Rambam. So he reads the Rambam with care. He's fascinated by the Rambam because the Rambam is a codifier, also like him. And he works out what the Rambam is saying and somewhat links the Rambam to other views. He says the Rambam says this, but there are different opinions like that. Finally, he decides to write a summary of the Beis Yosef. And he says, look, the Beis Yosef is a mammoth work, so I'm just going to take my halachic conclusions and put them into a short work so that people can quickly review it. I don't really expect anyone to paskin the whole time from the Shulchan Aruch. The real source of psak is my encyclopedic work, the Beis Yosef, but I think it'd be useful for people to have like a brief summary, like a bullet point summary of my halachic conclusions. And I'm going to write it very briefly so everyone can do chazor on it every 30 days. So gentlemen, ladies, every 30 days you can go through the whole Shulchan Aruch, and he divides it up into divisions of 30 days. So that way everyone can review all halacha every 30 days. And but your real work and life project is the Beis Yosef. Okay, so we'll have to stop here today because we've run out of time. But very briefly, this is a figure who's capable of writing a Magid Meisharim, capable of writing hundreds of teshuvos, and we have many of them. He's a Rosh Hashiva, a world leader, an Av Beis Din, and author of the Beis Yosef, which is simply and indescribably an incredible work. What does it mean to, on any sugya, know 30 plus commentaries on the sugya and draw out the legal principles, structure them, arrange them in systematic conversation, and then draw halachic conclusions? And he does this by himself. Any one work would have put him down in history forever. Kasef Mishnah alone on the Rambam would have been enough to put him down in history. And then to tie it all into the Shulchan Aruch, which, as we will see next week, meets points of resistance, but also very quickly becomes the preeminent halachic work. I will finish off by saying that this is the towering halachist of I don't know, 1,000 years. He's referred to almost universally as the Mechaber, the author. So when you say the author, it just gives you an idea of his prominence. And he's also referred to as Moron, the master, the teacher. It's linked to the word etymologically, Morenu, like our teacher, or More, the teacher. He is Moron. He is the halachic master of all time, and that gives us some indication of this incredible figure's outstanding achievements. He has 87 years to do it, but that's too short to understand how someone could pull that off. We'll stop here for today. Next week, I'll try and explore more what the Shulchan Aruch is, what the Beis Yosef is, how they work halachically, and then we'll tell the story of the Ramah and how these two individuals end up sort of interacting with each other in an incredible way. But I think this is just, both of them are such incredible figures. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I wish you all a good day.
Thank you.
Sorry? Yes, they are consistent. It's just it's mind-boggling. It's just truly mind-boggling that no, they're consistent. Yeah, he must have such an organized mind. It's just it's almost incomprehensible.